welcome back to another week of the RevMD podcast. I'm excited to be here this week to talk to you about non-covered charges. If you are new to the podcast, my name is Heather Signorelli. I'm a physician executive and really just a lover of all things on the business side of medicine. We own a full-service medical billing and coding company called National Revenue Consulting, and we're here to give physicians and other healthcare providers the education that they need in order to get the revenue that they deserve, that they can have an understanding of the overall medical billing and coding process, and really just crush it, because we know it's harder and harder to get paid for the services we provide. And our team is here to help our clients do that, as well as this free resource. And as always, we do not do any advertising on the RevMD podcast. So we would greatly appreciate if you could do two things. If you could go and share the podcast with a friend, or leave us a review on the Apple Podcast platform or any platform that you're listening this podcast to. We really, really appreciate it. It helps us reach more physicians. All right. So this week, we're going to talk about types of non-covered charges. And now, what does that even mean? We're going to talk about that. What can you do about it? And some things that you need to make sure your office is doing from a compliance standpoint in order to bill patients for non-covered charges. Now, as always, please note our podcast is for educational purposes only. If you have any questions regarding these topics, please discuss with your legal or your compliance team or your certified billing and coding team. All right, first let's go over those main reasons you may not be paid by a carrier. So, right, those reasons why you may have something that comes back as non-covered. So, number one is going to be services are deemed not medically reasonable or necessary. Number two, things are just not covered by the payer in any circumstance. They're just non-covered in general. Number three, services are denied as either a bundle or it's included in some other service or by another physician or provider. And so therefore, it's not going to be covered or paid for under your own office's billing. And number four, services are just reimbursable by another organization or furnished without a charge. And again, we're not talking about all denial reasons. We're just talking about non-covered charges. Now, for Medicare, there are rules around when you can bill the patient for services that are not paid. And it's important for you to know these things so that you can increase the likelihood of getting paid by a patient if you want to do, change that to patient responsibility. Now, there are other reasons and things that aren't paid, like coordination of benefits issues, which we're really not going to talk about today. So let's go back to our list. So we've got our top four things. We're going to talk about each of those, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the things you need to do in your office to ensure that you can bill those patients, again, to put it towards patient responsibility. So the first one, right, charges that are not deemed medically necessary. This is really important to understand because we get a lot of these types of denials, and they can be painful for both the billing team as well as the office because we're going back and forth on reconsiderations, and that takes time, right? Every time you submit a reconsideration, that takes, 15, 30, 45 days, maybe longer, depending on the payer. And so you've got to really make sure that when you submit a CPT, right, when you're billing up for a service, that you understand what diagnoses or what ICD-10 codes make that CPT code medically necessary. And this is so many denials that we see in our practices, and a large reason why, we've created these denial trackers so we can go back and forth with the office and say, hey, that's not considered medically necessary. It's not covered. We need a new ICD-10 code. And then the question comes, okay, if we get a new ICD-10 code, making sure you're putting that in the documentation, right? Because the last thing you want to do is have the payer come back and say, well, I want to now see the medical records and you don't have it documented. So, really want to make sure that you guys understand that when something comes back is not covered because of it's not deemed medically necessary, that's often related to the ICD-10 codes that you're dropping. Now, good news though. So there are ways for you to get a list, at least in the Medicare world, and then you can kind of make some assumptions in the private pay commercial world. But on the Medicare side, you can actually head over to the CMS website and go check out the National Coverage Determinations, or NCDs, and the Local Coverage Determination called LCDs. And these are both documents that provide information regarding around CPTs and ICD-10 codes, a lot of different types of billing information. So basically, you can go on there, search up different CPT codes, and see the ICD-10 codes that would make that medically necessary. Now, as I just said, you have to make sure that your documentation supports it, and obviously that truly did happen with the patient. But it's an easy way to understand, okay, this is the CPT that I'm doing, and this is more common with procedures. Then I need to drop one of these ICD-10 codes. I need to make sure I'm telling the story. And you guys have heard me talk about this before, right? It's all about telling the story, what's going on with the patient, not just, one thing, but if there's multiple things going on, drop all of those ICD-10 codes, tell that story, and make sure your office understands what is typically deemed medically necessary, especially for some of those procedures that you have in your office. And that allows these denials to decrease, which means your AR team is not spending time on coding issues and going back and forth with coding issues, and instead they're able to focus on your overall AR for other types of claims that may need to be dealt with. Again, the higher your denials are, the harder and harder it is to manage a very busy practice as AR. And so whatever you guys can do to help have a good coordination of that effort between the office and between your billers is really going to make things successful. And that's where I've seen a lot of practices AR get really out of control. All right. So for the second category of non-covered charges, this is related to non-covered charges that are just never paid under any circumstance by a payer. And these could be a number of different types of services, maybe something that's furnished outside of the United States, or certain types of routine physical checkups, an eye exam or eyeglasses, hearing aids, certain immunizations that are not deemed covered, some things like cosmetic surgery, for example, right? These are just things that are never covered. And payers will be pretty clear with what is never covered. So it's not a guessing game. It's not about the ICD-10s you drop. It's just the CPT is never covered. And Medicare, again, is really good about clarifying what's covered and not covered. And so you can easily find that. Now, with commercial payers, that gets a little bit more tricky. And that's why it's always important for certain special services or certain things, doing that prior authorization, right? Checking and seeing if this is a covered benefit. And there's a lot of controversy around, is it your job as the office to understand if something is covered or not? And, I can go either way on this, right? You can sit there and argue that, yeah, it is our job as physicians because patients don't know how to navigate that world. And so we should be checking on things. Or it can be one of those things where the office just knows, okay, here's the list of things that we've had denials with that are not covered. And I need to make sure that I'm providing that information to the patients up front so that they know, okay, here's, some potential non-covered services. Here's what that self-pay rate would be. And if I do get a denial from my insurance company because it is non-covered, I can be expected to pay the patient responsibility. So we'll talk a little bit about that here in a minute, but I just want to clarify that in regards to non-covered charges. So again, things that are just not paid for by a payer. So the next two categories I'm really not going to talk a ton about, but I'm just going to touch on. So that third category was when services are bundled. And so that's important to understand when services are bundled and when they're not bundled. So you do want to have some understanding, and your billers should be able to help you with this if you don't know. And again, Medicare has a really great way of being able to tell you those types of things. So important to understand, if something is bundled, that means you've got two services that are actually, included in one CPT code, depending on the services that you're providing. Now, the last reason for denied services is related to services that are going to be reimbursable by another entity. So things like an automobile or liability insurance or workman's comp. So again, those are not going to be covered by the payers. And so you may get a denial for that. And so just important to recognize when that happens. And then that's a matter of making sure that that information is getting to the right entity. And so you'll want to have some sort of mechanism by which the billers are being able to provide the office with that information so that, the workman's comp or whatever the payer should be is notified. And this is why we have a million different trackers in our own billing company, because it's hard to keep track in all of this in email. I really try and keep us out of email. I know it's the easy button, but emails get lost. They get lost to follow up. And then you don't have a mechanism to say, hey, here's the 10 things I sent over the last month. How many of them are still pending? So we do try and really keep all of our trackers going so that we can make sure that the office has what they need and that we're following up with the office when we don't hear back from something. I also think with all of this, it does really matter to have a strong financial responsibility policy in your practice, something that the patients can look at and they can understand things like no-show fees, understand things like who's responsible for paying for things when they're not covered, when and how often are they going to get billed for something, do you do a credit card on file, talking about eligibility and whose responsibility it is to make sure that they have active coverage, right? That's not the office's, that's theirs. Now, it is, in my opinion, the office's responsibility to check that eligibility ahead of time, to try and get ahead of it so that if they are out of network or there is a coverage issue, you have that conversation up front. So then you're alerting them to say, hey, we recognize that you're out of network, you're now an out of network patient. Here's what that means. Here's the rates for that. Again, there's very particular rules, especially with Medicare, around making sure that they're aware of certain non-covered benefits, which we're going to talk about ABNs next. So again, do you have a patient payment policy in your office? What kind of components does that have? And maybe I spend the next podcast just talking about patient payment policies and what should be in those and some examples of that. But in general, you really want to get into a habit of checking eligibility. If you need to do a prior auth, do that. Checking all that stuff ahead of time, resolving any issues that you may have with eligibility as the patient comes in. And then last, making sure that they have some general idea, whether that's with a pamphlet or with a policy or both, around what is deemed a non-covered charge and who's going to be responsible for that and what are estimates around that. Now, for your Medicare patients, there may be services that are considered not medically necessary and reasonable. And so those are going to be the sort of things that you do need to, for a Medicare patient, have them sign an ABN for. So an ABN is an advance beneficiary notice. And there are examples of this all over the internet. So you can go to CMS's website and get examples of this. And they do require, Medicare requires that these are signed before you are able to bill the patient for something that Medicare will deny as investigational or not medically necessary. And so you do want to make sure that, that type of reasoning for a denial, that you have sat down with the patient, that they've been provided an ABN, which is really a form that they sign and they say, hey, I recognize that this may be investigational or not deemed medically necessary by Medicare. So I'm going to sign this ABN. And that allows the patient, right, to make a decision, right? Do they want to do this? Do they accept financial responsibility if Medicare does not pay? And just really allows that patient to participate in those treatment decisions by making those informed decisions. And it's going to list items that services are not covered, right? So it's going to list out the things that Medicare is not expected to pay for and the reasons they may not pay for them. And then, of course, the estimate of costs for those things. And here's the kicker. If a patient does not receive an ABN when it is required, then they're not going to be held responsible for the bill, and you're not going to be able to send patient responsibility to them. So it is really important for you to understand what Medicare may deem as not medically necessary, and then you can send the patient the bill and have them be fiscally responsible for that service. So extremely, extremely important. Now, there are things that we talked about, right, that are never covered by Medicare. Never, never, never covered. Some examples of that are like the 99381 or other preventative services or some types of immunizations outside of the things they do cover, which is influenza, pneumonia, and Hep B. So again, those non-covered charges, okay, never, never covered. They don't actually technically require an ABM because they're never considered covered by Medicare. Now, I'm going to tell you, right, you guys know your Medicare patients. I know the Medicare patients that are out there. They don't know the difference between these things. And so I do really find that it is best practice to do some sort of voluntary ABN or voluntary written consent to discuss with the patient that here are things that may not be covered, or here are things that are never covered. And they know the estimate of charges. They can make the decision whether they want them or not. And truly, if you can do this before the patient's in the office, that saves everybody some time. And again, I know this is all kind of admin headaches and time suck for your office, but I'm going to tell you, spending time on a service that you're never going to get paid for is just as much of a waste of time. So figuring out how to make this a part of your eligibility, prior auth, kind of financial responsibility group of individuals is going to be really, really important. So again, you got a patient payment policy, you talk about non-covered charges, you talk about things that may not be medically necessary, you give estimates of charges, you have them sign this. That's just going to make both your patients, and it's not going to suck up time doing things that you're never going to get paid for. So again, what did that ABN need to cover, right? It's got to cover the detailed description of services to be provided, estimate of costs within, about $100. So it doesn't need to be perfect, but you need to get it somewhere close. And then the reason that it's believed that Medicare is not going to cover this charge. And if you do obtain an ABN, there is a modifier. So the modifier is GA, which is basically a waiver of liability. And that does need to be added to the claim to indicate that the patient was notified. So that is just something that you need to communicate to your billing team that, hey, we've signed an ABN for this, please put that modifier on there. Now, when a patient does get an ABN, they may still ask you to submit a claim because they want an official payment decision. And so you can certainly do that. But obviously you only do that if the patient actually receives the service. So get the ABN. You can certainly still submit the claim to Medicare, put the modifier in there. If it gets denied, flip it to patient responsibility. Now, please note that you need to make sure that for Medicare patients, you're also billing all of the CPTs that you should bill, meaning you cannot do something and then only bill for one of the services, not all the services that you provided, just because Medicare won't pay for it. And Medicare does actually have strict billing rules around this. And so you do actually want to make sure that you're dropping charges for all the things you did, you're alerting patients of, the non-covered piece, signing those, payment policies, and you'll be good to go. All right. So to summarize, we talked about 4 things today that could be non-covered. And so you're going to want to make sure that you understand these 4 different things, right? So we talked about services that are not deemed medically reasonable or necessary, right? So that has to do with the CPT and ICD-10 matchups, right? And then we talked about things that are just never covered by a payer, and that could be Medicare or commercial payer. And we talked about things that could be bundled or things that are reimbursable by, say, workman's comp. And those are kind of the 4 things we talked about. We talked in detail about things that are not medically reasonable or necessary and those that are just never covered. And we talked a little bit about ABNs and making sure that you provide notification and written consent for things that are not considered medically necessary, and then how that differs from alerting patients of never ever covered types of CPT codes and how you get that, how you can flip those to patient responsibility. Again, best practice is for your office to really have, a group of individuals who are really dedicated to eligibility prior auths. And then depending on your procedure load, if you do have a high procedure load, then really, sitting down with the patients and making sure that they understand, hey, these are the types of things that may not be paid, they may not be covered, and here's the estimate of costs that could be. Big fan of keeping credit cards on file. We see lots and lots of patient AR that is balloons up. And so it's really important to have a really strong patient payment policy in your office. Get those things collected up front as much as you can, or credit cards on file to bill for any balances that are due over 30 days or 60 days under a certain amount. So again, I'll come back and talk about patient payment policies here in another podcast, but hopefully this has been helpful. You guys have a great rest of your weekend, and we will talk to you next week on the RevMD podcast. And again, if you are looking for a new medical billing and coding team, we would be happy to chat. You can reach us at info@nationalrevenueconsulting.com or head over to our website, nationalrevenueconsulting.com. All right, talk to you soon.